It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Doug Blackmon. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. One of the great paradoxes of our national political life these days centers on the role and vitality of the media. We constantly hear that news organizations are less influential than ever, that they are economically doomed, that fewer and fewer citizens get news from traditional sources such as newspapers and nightly broadcasts, and that political candidates can simply bypass the media and speak directly to the people. Journalists like me, who made a living with ink and paper for 30 years, look like dinosaurs. Yet at the same time, we are awash in what feels like more political media than ever. Fox News has been raking in cash and trouncing CNN and MSNBC for years. The scandal-obsessed internet-based Drudge Report has been getting more than 1 billion page views per month of late. Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal, my old home, has 2 million readers a day, the most of any U.S. newspaper, and almost twice as many as that little old also ran in the number 2 spot, the New York Times. The legendary Washington Post, it barely registers on that radar screen. How is all that possible? Our guest in this episode of American Forum suggests we may fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the current revolution in political media, and that we definitely have misunderstood its origins. Historian NIKKI HEMMER has just come out with a new book, Messengers of the Right: Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, in which she maps out how, in the aftermath of World War II, media entrepreneurs began building the modern conservative movement. She argues essentially that right-leaning media came first and launched the breakaway political activism that has profoundly reshaped Republican politics, given rise to Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, and so much of the conservative political revolution of the past 4 decades. And now, in 2016, has given the nation Donald Trump. Hemmer is an assistant professor in presidential studies here at the Miller Center, a contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report, and a co-host of Past Present, a history podcast launched in October 2015. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Take it back to the beginning, the story that you tell, of when what we now would call conservative media, when that began, what some would disparagingly call right-wing media, but maybe that's not. But go back in time. In terms of intellectual DNA, tell us who Sean Hannity's great-granddaddy is.
Sean Hannity's great-granddad. Well, the story really starts in the 1940s and the 1950s. If you want sort of a start date, it's in 1940 and 1941 with the America First Committee. This was a group of people who were against American intervention in World War II, and there were a lot of conservatives among them who believed that it just wasn't the US's responsibility to get involved in Europe's war. And they found themselves shut out. They saw that neither the Democratic nor the Republican Party agreed with them. They found themselves pushed out of major newspapers and magazines and disparaged. And they didn't call this liberal media bias, but they did call it bias. They did call it a blackout. And that experience of not having their views heard, of having all sorts of social and economic and political capital, but not being able to do anything with it, that sense of frustration is what ends up feeding this new right-wing media in the aftermath of World War II, when those same frustrations resurface in the fight against communism and the extension of the New Deal and all of these policies that they so deeply disagreed with, but that the two parties and most of the major media endorsed.
And so these folks who have been involved in America First, who then kind of have to go out of sight or change their minds during the period of World War II, it's also a little amazing to even imagine that it was possible to be politically rehabilitated after World War II if you had been, at least the way we remember those times now, to have opposed fighting the Nazis and Imperial Japan. One would have imagined that would have been a faction of American life that would have no political future after the war. But it does. There's a reformation, and there's some specific people, some of whose names we may be faintly familiar with, but many of them not. But so how does that happen after World War II?
Right, so it does happen in the early years immediately after World War II, when the same folks who were involved with America First regroup, and they want to advance their politics in this new post-war world. And so people like Felix Morley start a little weekly newsletter called Human Events. Human Events is still around today, but it gets its start in 1944, and it doesn't have many subscribers at first. It is very much on the outskirts of politics because there is still this sort of revisionist history about the war at the heart of it, but it slowly begins to morph into a newsletter that covers domestic and foreign policy, and that's conservative. And they bring on a young man in 1945 named Henry Regnery. And Regnery may be a name that viewers are familiar with because Regnery in 1947, he breaks off from Human Events and he starts his own conservative publishing company, Regnery Publishing. It isn't very profitable in the period between the 1940s and the 1970s, but it would become so. It's the name behind many of the bestsellers that you see in bookstores today.
Yeah, it's now Regnery Press, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and so yeah, almost every polemical conservative book that you, but that is still somewhat philosophical or political science,
right.
High likelihood that it's coming from Regnery Press today, even though he's long gone, right?
That's right. He's long gone, but the press is still around, and it's now turning a profit, something he never saw.
Yeah, I imagine so. But so there's Regnery, there's Clarence Mannion, William Rusher, who publishes the National Review. But you also describe very interesting sort of visual anecdote. You describe a gathering in 1953 in room 2233 in the Lincoln Building in New York City. Who was at that, and why is that such an important gathering of people?
So this was an important gathering because in 1953, Henry Regnery calls together all of these different conservative media figures. It's 53, so Mannion's radio program doesn't start till 54. National Review isn't launched until 1955, but you do have these conservative writers and conservative broadcasters who are beginning to come together. And the point of the meeting was twofold. One, to sort of note that here were these people who had so much power and so little political influence, and they had to do something about that. And Regnery said the reason we don't have the influence we should have is because we don't control the means of communication. So on the one hand, it was about trying to coordinate some more conservative media, but it was also about trying to make some inroads politically, to begin to cultivate new candidates, to build new parties so that conservatives would have a political home from which they could advance their policies and they could begin to win elections and make real political change.
It's 53, but at this stage, they're not so much licking their wounds from what had happened in World War II, but more from the rise of Dwight Eisenhower. Give us the context of why this is also an anti-Eisenhower beginning.
Absolutely. So 1952 is a critical turning point for the birth of conservative media because so many of the people who would go on to found the Mannion Forum, who would found National Review, they were big Robert Taft supporters. Taft was the conservative senator from Ohio, and he was seen as the next in line for the Republican nomination. And what happens? This upstart who'd never been a political figure before, who had no political experience.
Wait a minute, upstart,
right?
Never a political figure before. Oh, I'm sorry.
But who was one of the biggest celebrities of the early 1950s.
Wow.
This political upstart comes out of nowhere, and he becomes the Republican nominee. And for conservatives, there was a belief right from the start that that nomination had been stolen. They constantly pushed back against Eisenhower. In the very first issue of National Review, they have all of these long anti-Eisenhower screeds, and they specifically point to that 52 nomination as the moment when they knew that they weren't going to be accepted as a major political force in the United States. Clarence Mannion, who started the Mannion Forum, he hung on in 1952, even though he was a big Taft supporter. He went out and he backed Eisenhower. He dutifully fell in line, and he was even part of the Eisenhower administration. But like many other conservatives who made their way into the administration, they quickly found themselves butting heads with these more moderate Republicans, and then They eventually, in Mannion's case, get fired, and then they go off and they start their own organizations. And he got fired because he was supporting this little-known amendment called the Bricker Amendment. It was a sort of a national sovereignty resolution. And the people who supported the Bricker Amendment said, look, you're an effective speaker. You have this story of being booted out of the Eisenhower administration for sticking to your guns. We want to give you some airtime to spread your message, so maybe we can rally up support for the Bricker Amendment across the country. So they bought him 13 weeks of airtime, where he would appear not 3 hours a day like Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity, but for 15 minutes every week to not just talk about the Bricker Amendment, but to talk about conservatism. And he was so successful at it that those 13 weeks, which started in October of 1954, become 25 years.
And there's a discussion at one point about the possibility of creating a new party, the American Party, as it's called, and that all of this is going to be an alternative to what they perceive as being a choice between New Deal Democrats and New Deal Republicans, as you write, or quote someone saying. But that idea that the Republicans are actually New Dealers just as the Democrats are, and so they're trying to create this third way, but which never quite works. I mean, that idea of a conventional party never quite works. Why was that? And what was the plan at that time?
So they certainly were going to try to launch a third party. In 1956, the American Party, with T. Coleman Andrews at its head, they were going to try to effect a realignment. They wanted to grab conservatives from the South who were Democrats and conservatives from the North who were Republicans and bring them together in a new party. And there were a lot of different schemes for how this was going to work, but every time they tried to put it into practice, it didn't really. And the reason why they stopped pinning their hopes on third party politics, at least for a while, was Barry Goldwater. So in the late 1950s, Clarence Mannion meets Barry Goldwater. He has him on his show. It's the first national radio appearance for Goldwater. And he sees in him a potential fusion figure. He's someone who can appeal to Democrats in the South because of his opposition to civil rights, but he's also someone who can appeal to Western libertarians and Northern Bob Taft supporters. So he's seen as this fusion figure. And so Mannion is like, how do we make Barry Goldwater a household name? And not just a household name, but the face of conservatism across the nation. And his idea is to have Goldwater write a manifesto. Goldwater was a little busy, so he lined up a ghostwriter. He couldn't find a publisher for the book, so he ends up self-publishing it through his own little publishing company that he has. And that book, Conscience of a Conservative, not only becomes a bestseller, but it makes Barry Goldwater a nationally known conservative figure and the best hope for conservatives, not to have a third party candidate, because Goldwater wasn't interested in that, but to become the Republican nominee, which he is in 1964.
One might have said Goldwater's collapse would have snuffed out this whole phenomenon, but it didn't.
Right. In fact, many people did say that at the time. So the New York Times had an editorial the next day that it was essentially like, oh, thank goodness, conservatism is done. And we can now go on with a newer, rational, forward-looking, progressive politics in both parties. For conservatives, Goldwater was an important moment, but it wasn't the end game. They had done something no one thought that they could do. They had managed to win the nomination of a major party with someone whose beliefs were often seen as on the fringes of American politics. What the Goldwater loss taught them, though, was that they hadn't done enough to reach out beyond just conservatives. That in many ways, in building this conservative media movement over the 1950s and early 1960s, they had been coalescing their own power, but they had largely been talking to themselves. And so they take up so many new initiatives in 1965 and in the late 1960s to begin to try to reach out, not to conservatives, because they already have conservatives, but to reach out to what they call the apathetic. The average American who maybe doesn't really think a lot about politics or about these ideas and doesn't understand what's at stake. And so they do a lot of things trying to distribute programs so that they reach college students as opposed to simply going out into conservative communities. They actually helped launch the American Conservative Union. It was media activists who formed the American Conservative Union after the 1964 loss. This was a moment when they wanted to take all of their expertise and ideas, but use them more effectively for politics, to use them for effective political organizing that has direct electoral implications. And that was a big change after 1964.
So if somehow it were possible to have Senator Goldwater sitting at the table with us, What would he say, do you think, to the proposition that, in effect, he was a creation of media rather than that his emergence and his thinking and his influence created a rich thing for media to cover? I mean, how would he react to your proposition that he's a product of these media forces?
Well, Barry Goldwater was a man who did not like to be handled. So this idea that he was a product of anyone other than himself, I think he probably would not agree strongly with. But fortunately, he's not here. So we can look back at the historical record and see the ways in which conservatives co-opted, in many ways, Barry Goldwater and brought him into the 1964 election kicking and screaming. He didn't want to be running for office through much of 1963, and they said they were just going to draft him. And that's what they end up doing. And they end up creating a campaign that runs alongside his campaign. So by the time he gets the nomination, he's not interested in hanging out with conservatives anymore. He really closes himself off. He hires his Arizona mafia, all of his close friends, to run his campaign. So conservative media simply develop an alternative campaign running alongside the Goldwater campaign, which really was the first media-driven campaign of the modern era, where they were defining the race through their own media to their audiences as a race between a conservative and a liberal, a chance for a choice.
And so how do we get from these figures you've been talking about? I don't believe any of them end up as early investors in Fox News or allies of Rupert Murdoch. So how do we get from them to the current conservative media world that surrounds us?
Well, so by the mid to late 1970s, many of these media enterprises that I write about, they were kind of running out of steam. They didn't have a lot of money. It was a really tumultuous time, both within conservatism and the Republican Party and the nation at large. And so they're largely out of power by the 1970s. And then you have the Reagan administration, and there isn't a strong conservative media operating during the Reagan administration. You have Human Events and National Review still there, but they're sort of riding the wave. They're not creating the wave. Where you get a second generation of conservative media is with the rise of Rush Limbaugh in 1988 when he goes national, and he's really coming off of this Reagan crest. The connection between the two, even though they're very different, is that what Rush Limbaugh and Fox News inherited was this conservative identity that had been crafted over 50 years, where conservatives, as part of being conservative, sought out conservative media sources, rejected mainstream media as being biased, and looked for media that was conservative. And so in many ways, there was an audience waiting, and that audience was built by this first generation.
And is there anything bad about this?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I do think that what we've seen in the last several years in particular, there's been a lot of attention paid to the role of conservative media in politics. And one of the issues has been the close relationship, the incredibly close relationship between conservative media and the Republican Party in a way that was very different from this first generation. This first generation worked very closely with Republican politicians, but they didn't really have veto power in the way that they seemed to have in the 20-aughts and the early 20-teens. This idea that you didn't want to cross Rush Limbaugh, you didn't want to cross Fox News because you were going to pay a real political price for it. And that has brought the Republican Party further to the right. So depending on where you stand on right-wing politics is whether that's a good thing or not. I do think that if there is a downside to it more broadly, it's that this criticism of media as being biased has helped to feed a distrust in media and a fragmentation of media that have left Americans without a common ground, a common news source, a common place of conversation, or even a common set of agreed upon facts. And that then creates a political debate that doesn't work because you're not debating on the same grounds. You're talking past one another. And if there's an outcome of that, I think that it's at least in part this idea that our current obstructionist politics comes out of that inability to actually talk to one another, to agree upon a certain set of things, and then move forward based on that agreement. certainly the attacks on the establishment and the justification for tearing down an establishment that courses through conservatism and conservative media from the 1940s on is very much present in the politics of Trump, as is this idea that the media are biased and they're not telling you the truth, that they're forcing everyone to be politically correct and not actually telling you how things are. That suspicion and some conspiracism as well that has been present in conservatism over the past 70 years. Those aren't always dominant in the conservative movement or conservative media, but they have been there and they're sort of becoming focused upon and condensed under Trump.
And we also are in this time now where I think it's true that more so than ever before, just because of social media and the ease with which this can happen, but that we are now in a time in which it's not just an argument over what's a common set of facts, but in which there's this wholesale invention of false facts that surrounds political activity. It's astonishing to me how much material's out there that is abjectly false. I mean, the birther claim is the most fundamental of those. But even the idea that not this year, but that you could have a Medal of Honor winner's, the veracity of a Medal of Honor winner's story of their service in war be questioned, openly questioned on the basis of clearly false claims. But there has to be an audience for all of this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work unless there's an audience, and that's the American people. And so, has something changed with the American people? Was it that at one time we had our parents or grandparents had a demand for truth and a better sense of what's BS and what's not, and now we don't have that, or is there something else?
Well, I think that it's a combination of things. First of all, trust in any sort of authority has disappeared. And that is somewhat new. And so I hear this a lot. I hear it from my hairdresser. I hear it from people that I talk to when I talk to them about media. They're so frustrated because they don't know what to believe. They haven't been taught the skills that they need in order to wade through so much inaccurate information. We are in a new media environment that allows for false information to gain quite a bit of traction, but also you don't have an authority that you can turn to and say, tell me what's true. And I think that is part of the reason why conservative media has become so much more important in the last 10 to 15 years, is because if you have that ideological agreement, you can say to a Sean Hannity, I trust you. Just tell me what's true, because I can't make sense of all of this. And is that entirely new? People have always sort of looked to authorities in order to help them make sense of the world. I think what is troubling for democracy about this is that without any sense of what is real and what is not, I think that you lack the informed citizenry that you need in order to create an effective and useful politics.
So I want to put you on the spot. Is conservative media, as you've been describing it here, is it less reliable than in terms of facts, than mainstream media, what would be conventionally called mainstream media? Is that the case? And then finally, last thought, is this a call to action of some sort? Should something be different, or are you just observing a set of realities? But is there something that should happen? But first are you saying that conservative media, flat out, is just less reliable and less factual than conventional media?
I'm saying that it has become less reliable. I think that at the start, it was bringing to the table stories and ideas that were being overlooked by conventional media. And that was actually bringing more good, useful information to the table. I think that as conservative media grew bigger and more insular, there was less of a feedback mechanism to make sure that what they were saying was comporting with reality. And that disconnect has been recognized not just by liberals, but by conservatives as well. Charlie Sykes, who is a conservative radio show host in Wisconsin, has talked about this. He says, we need to have a reckoning because we've divorced conservatives from the feedback loop with what's going on in the world. Is it a call to action? The only reason that I might say it's not a call to action is because I don't know how you fix this. I think it's something that we continue to talk about, but if you don't have someone who can be an authority and say, now wait a second, that's not true and you shouldn't believe it, I don't know how you fix the problem without someone who can draw those lines.
NIKKI HEMMER, thanks for being here. The book is Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media, and the Transformation of American Politics. We hope you'll keep this conversation going about our media, our politics, and most of all, how citizens across the entire spectrum of political perspectives can engage with each other, be civil in our dialogue, listen to one another, maybe get a few things done. In these tumultuous days, let's believe in each other and in our democracy. That's the first requirement of patriotism. We also hope you'll join our conversation at the Miller Center Facebook page or by following us on Twitter at American Forum TV, or you can also tweet me directly at Douglas Blackmon or today's guest, Nikki Hemmer, at Past Punditry. To watch other episodes of American Forum, download audio podcasts, or read transcripts of these conversations, visit us at millercenter.org, American Forum. I'm Doug Blackmon. See you next week. Thanks again.